What if violent crime didn't actually surge in the 1970s? Would you believe it? From misconceptions about murders and muggings to the truth about disco being a fad, here's why everything you heard about the 1970s is wrong. Watch any movie set in a major city in the 1970s, and you were almost guaranteed to see rubble-strewn empty lots, gangs of criminals prowling freely, and desperate police under siege. As 538 reports, part of this narrative was the idea that the Bronx is burning, meaning things had gotten so bad in New York that landlords were torching their own property for the insurance money. The movie poster for the 1979 cult classic The Warriors summed up the popular concept of urban life in the 1970s. These are the armies of the night. They are 100,000 strong. They outnumber the cops 5 to 1. They could run New York City.
Can you dig it?
That's dramatic stuff, but things weren't as bad as you think. Those fires in the Bronx weren't the desperate criminal acts of slumlords. As author Joe Flood notes in his book The Fires, they were probably due to a flawed effort to improve fire department response times. And as the New York Times reports, while crime was certainly high in the 1970s in cities like New York, there was also a thriving underground art scene. So throughout that decade, places like New York had a sense of freedom and excitement that can't be matched by today's manicured and corporate-dominated cities. While it's true that cities in the 1970s had their problems, they were never the gang-dominated wastelands you see in movies. One of the worst misconceptions about the 1970s is that it was a 10-year block of time that was instantly distinct from the 1960s and the 1980s. However, it's kind of silly to think that in December of 1969, hippies were still singing about love, and then a month later a bunch of punks showed up and kicked off the new decade. As LitHub notes, many historians believe the political and social trends of the 1960s continued well into the 1970s, without interruption. Many of the things we associate with the 1960s continued into the next decade, after all. The Vietnam War didn't end until 1975, and protest songs like John Lennon's Imagine and Marvin Gaye's What's Going On actually came out in 1971. The International Center on Nonviolent Conflict officially lists 1973 as the ending point for the anti-war protests that we think defined the 1960s. Furthermore, bands that we think of as defining the 1970s actually got their start in the 1960s. Led Zeppelin was the biggest rock band in the world in the 70s, but released their first album in 1969. And the Washington Post makes the case that even the hippies, the most iconic symbol of the 1960s, actually hit their peak of influence and popularity in the 1970s. Plenty of jokes have been made about the style of the 1970s. Even the words shag carpet evoke a specific idea of what the decade looked like. Today, the 1970s are widely remembered as a decade where taste went to die. It was a time when the crisp, classic fashions of the 1950s and the far-out but decidedly cool fashions of the 1960s were replaced by out-of-control sideburns, wide-lapel jackets, and lots of gold chains. Similarly, interior design was marred by avocado appliances, crochet and macrame everywhere, and vinyl tablecloths. Sure, it's funny to think that the style of the 1970s was tacky and awful, but it's also inaccurate. Every decade has its style mistakes. It's just that they usually aren't defined by them. The fact is, the 1970s are considered by many to have been one of the greatest decades ever for fashion and design. And as the New York Times notes, many design and style trends dating back to the 1970s are not only coming back in a big way, but are influencing new trends. In fact, as the Times points out, one reason the 1970s were so wild in terms of style was a distinct shift towards self-expression that was made possible by the movements of the previous decade. People were finally given permission to personalize their homes and wardrobes, and the result was a burst of creativity. Not all of it was classic, of course, but a lot of it was. When people think of the 1970s, they often think of a surge in violent crime, with muggers targeting graffiti-covered subway cars and serial killers like the Son of Sam preying on innocent people. The 1970s are usually depicted as an entire decade of folks getting mugged and murdered. The fact is, these trends began long before the 1970s. As the Brennan Center for Justice notes, violent crime increased 60% nationwide during the 1970s. However, that surge followed an increase of 126% in the 1960s. And yet we think of the 1960s as the decade of peace and love.
We would all like to be able to live an uncluttered life, a simple life, a good life.
And as Time magazine notes, violent crime has actually been worse in recent years. In 2013, for example, there were 1.16 million violent crimes in the United States. However, that was cause for celebration. After all, violent crimes in 2013 were at their lowest number since 1978, when there were just 1.09 million violent crimes. In other words, we're celebrating having as much crime as we did in the supposedly hellish 1970s. The logline on 20th century cultural history is that the 1950s were straight-laced and marked by conformity, the 1960s were explosively creative, and the 1970s were marked by excess and a less creative energy. That's really not true, though. In just about every artistic category, the 1970s was a vibrant, happening time. Pitchfork makes the argument that the 1970s was actually pop music's golden age, and notes that music critic David Hepworth believes that the most influential rock albums ever made were released in 1971. The 1970s was also the decade that punk, new wave, and disco rose to prominence. So the 70s was clearly a frenetic decade of experimentation, rebellion, and reinvention in music. In many ways, the 1970s was also the golden age of Hollywood. After decades of being restrained by morality codes in the studio system, the 1970s saw the emergence of legendary filmmakers like Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg. Some of the most iconic films of all time were also released during the 70s.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
And it was also the decade when artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat, Jeff Koons, and Keith Haring began developing their work. Watergate was so powerfully negative, it actually forced President Richard Nixon to resign in 1974, making him the first president to do so. He made the decision in order to avoid an impeachment and possibly to ensure that his vice president Gerald Ford could pardon him once Ford assumed the presidency. You might assume that Watergate ruined the Republican Party, but you would be wrong. Yes, the Republicans suffered some electoral setbacks. In the 1974 elections, the Democrats gained 4 seats in the Senate and 49 seats in the House. And in 1976, the Democrats won the White House with Jimmy Carter. But as Politico reports, Watergate ultimately transformed the Republican Party into the much more conservative version that stormed back into power under Ronald Reagan in 1980. Moderate Republicans who voted in committee to approve articles of impeachment were maligned as not sufficiently Republican. As a result, the Republican Party reinvented itself. Far from ruining the party, there's a clear link between Watergate and the resurgent GOP in the late 1970s. Everyone knows the 1960s were all about protests and movements. Young people wanted to stop war, to end racism, and address poverty. Then the 1970s came along, and everyone just stopped caring about all that stuff. After all, it was the so-called me decade, so everyone was far too busy getting to know themselves to care much about anyone else. That's all nonsense, of course. The 1970s continued the trend of young people wanting to change the world for the better. As The Atlantic notes, although the Stonewall riots that sparked the gay rights movement happened in 1969, the movement gained national prominence in the 1970s. This was when LGBTQ people around the country organized and fought for their rights as human beings and citizens. The 1970s was also the decade when the United States came close to actually passing the Equal Rights Amendment and codifying women's equality in the Constitution. So the 1970s was far from a do-nothing decade when it came to social issues. While the events of the 1960s get all the press and popular memory, the 1970s were just as exciting in America. If you start talking about the 1970s, someone will bring up disco. The image of John Travolta dancing in his white leisure suit and Saturday Night Fever is usually what comes to mind when people think of disco, but that's a pretty superficial way of looking at an important musical form. Disco began in the 1960s at dance clubs known as discotheques, which is where the dance-focused musical style got its name. As Encyclopedia Britannica notes, disco was initially a very underground genre, embraced by the LGBTQ community. At the time, members of the LGBTQ community often encountered prejudice at clubs and bars, but they found community in underground clubs where disco was the music of choice. However, when disco hit the mainstream in the 1970s, it inspired a huge backlash.
Disco sucks! Disco sucks! Disco sucks!
As Vice notes, the hatred of disco on the part of rock fans may have had more to do with its connection to gay culture than its musical quality. Luckily, those efforts failed. Far from a 1970s fad, disco continues to be a vibrant musical genre that influences modern artists like Dua Lipa and The Weeknd. It's one of the most common images of the 1970s. People lined up for miles outside gas stations waiting to fuel up.
The line today is longer than it's ever been. I have no explanation for it.
So, what happened? Well, since the United States had reduced its own oil and gas production to very low levels, we had to rely on the oil being produced by other nations. These nations were members of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OAPEC. However, the member countries had never acknowledged the legitimacy of Israel. So when President Richard Nixon showed his support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, OAPEC announced an embargo on oil production. Prices surged as a result, gasoline shortages abounded, and a country that had grown very used to driving everywhere was suddenly constrained. Those lines of people waiting for gas became a symbol of a country in decline. But the embargo actually ended just 6 months later, in March 1974. While prices remained high for a while, the crisis was largely over by 1975. So it wasn't like everyone spent 10 years waiting in long lines because of a gas shortage. In the 21st century, it's easy to feel like we're living in the future. Our devices are artificially intelligent, our gadgets talk to us, and our entertainments are eye-poppingly realistic. You might pity the poor folks who lived through the 1970s, which was obviously a more primitive time. You might even wonder how in the world people entertain themselves in such a technologically backward period.
You are very smart for a human.
You hang around with smart, you get smart.
However, it actually wasn't all that different. Sure, 1970s folks didn't have iPhones to play with, but the first cell phone call was made in 1973. And although people living 50 years ago didn't have supercomputers in their pockets, the first personal computers did arrive in the 1970s. Video games were also a sensation in the 1970s. In fact, the first video game console came out in 1972. And no, there wasn't any Netflix, but folks did have cable TV in the 70s. In fact, almost everything we think of as modern-day technology existed in some form in the 1970s. Yes, it was usually bigger and slower, but it was still there.